This is the Thursday, May 31st afternoon session of the Portland City Council. We're now in session. Sue, would you please call the roll?
Fish.
Here.
Salzman.
Here.
Udaly.
Here.
Fritz.
I'm here. I have an excused absence at 3:30, which I mentioned so that folks can plan their breaks. Aye.
Wheeler.
Here. Good afternoon, Robert.
Welcome to the Portland City Council. The City Council represents all Portlanders and meets to do the city's business. The presiding officer preserves order and decorum during City Council meetings so everyone can feel welcome, comfortable, respected, and safe. To participate in council meetings, you may sign up in advance with the council clerk's office for communications to briefly speak about any subject. You may also sign up for public testimony on resolutions or the first readings of ordinances. Your testimony should address the matter being considered at the time. When testifying, please state your name for the record. Your address is not necessary. Please disclose if you are a lobbyist. If you are representing an organization, please identify it. The presiding officer determines the length of testimony. Individuals generally have 3 minutes to testify, unless otherwise stated. When you have 30 seconds left, a yellow light goes on. When your time is done, a red light goes on. If you are in the audience and would like to show your support for something that is said, please feel free to do a thumbs up. If you want to express that you do not support something, please feel free to do a thumbs down. Disruptive conduct, such as shouting or interrupting testimony or council deliberations, will not be allowed. If there are disruptions, a warning will be given that further disruption may result in the person being ejected for the remainder of the meeting. After being ejected, a person who fails to leave the meeting is subject to arrest for trespass. Thank you for helping your fellow Portlanders feel welcome, comfortable, respected, and safe.
Very good. Thank you, Robert. Sue, could you please read the first item?
Item 573, appeal on behalf of the Pearl District Neighborhood Association against Design Commission's decision of approval for design review with modifications and concurrent greenway review for the Fremont Apartments, a 17-story mixed-use building at 1650 Northwest Nadeau Parkway.
Colleagues, we tentatively voted to deny the appeal on May 10th, and we're back today for the adoption of the findings. I move that the council deny the appeal, uphold the decision of the Design Commission as modified by the design revisions submitted by the applicant, and adopt the findings.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Sue, please call the roll.
Fish.
Aye.
Salzman.
Aye.
Udaly.
Aye.
Fritz.
So the revised proposal, this is the Fremont Apartments. It addresses most of the concerns I previously expressed, as well as those expressed by the Parks Bureau, including it increases the minimum width of the Greenway Trail from 13 feet to 20 feet. It includes Americans with Disability Act compliance, including extension of the handrail and addition of the ramp to the artist studios. And it adds a public drinking fountain. In my view, it was unacceptable to call the Willamette River the water feature of a development proposal. This proposal still allows 84% of the plaza to be in shadow at noon, and the building doesn't step back adequately from the greenway to meet the required setback. Thus, it is the council's responsibility to provide safety for fragile public assets like the greenway, public plazas, and parks. And the current shadow standards don't ensure that light and warmth is maintained. This by itself, however, is something that can be approved as a modification, and the rest of the approval criteria are met. There is a missed opportunity here that had this project been required to reapply instead of having been modified at council, it would have yielded between 28 and 55 affordable units. Thank you very much to Ben Nielsen and Hillary Adam, Stacey Monroe, and Cara Fioravanti of the who staffed this on behalf of Planning Sustainability, Brett Horner with Portland Parks and Recreation, Lauren King, Lynn Lee Reese, and Tracy Reeve in the City Attorney's Office, the Pearl District Neighborhood Association, Stan Penkin, and many others who came to testify and thus pushed for this better design, and Claire Adamsick and Tim Crail in my office. Aye.
Wheeler.
Aye. Motion carries. Thank you. The next two items, 574 and 575, Commissioner Saltzman says they can be read together.
574, rename streets west of the Willamette River and east of Southwest Nato Parkway, Southwest Viewpoint Terrace, and Tryon Creek State Natural Area from southwest to south, creating a sixth addressing sextant in the city of Portland and Multnomah County, and rename Southwest Aventine Circus, Southwest Esquiline Circus, Southwest Front Avenue, Southwest Northgate Court, and Southwest South Ridge Drive. And 575, rename Southeast Martin Court for consistency with Southeast Martin's Court and Southeast Martin Street, and rename Southwest Radcliffe Street for consistency with Southwest Radcliffe Court and Southwest Radcliffe Lane and Southwest Radcliffe Road.
Commissioner Saltzman.
Thank you, Mayor. When seconds matter, it's important for our first responders, our 911 call dispatchers and call takers to know exactly which address they're responding to. And we have a situation right now that exists in Southwest Portland where confusion can reign supreme. If you live on 0255 Southwest Nevada, for instance, as opposed to 255 Southwest Nevada, well, you are not only separated by Interstate 5 freeway and about 700 feet of elevation, but that is too much time, and we can't allow for that kind of imprecision to exist, as I said, especially when first responders are involved. It's a fire, public safety, AMR response. And we can't have our call takers and our dispatchers at 911 taking the precious seconds to verify that we're actually going to 0255 Southwest Nevada as opposed to 255 Southwest Nevada. For whatever reason, a lot of people don't see a zero when it's the first leading number in an address. We could probably have great philosophical debates about the role of zero in that context, but we won't do that today. What we will do today is hopefully this council will set in motion the steps necessary to eliminate this situation and provide us with a new quadrant, or actually a sextant, in the city of Portland, which would be South Portland. And so we would have a South Portland demarcation and a Southwest. So the 0255 Southwest Nevada would be 255 South Nevada, and 255 Southwest Nevada would remain 255 Southwest Nevada. And our first responders would be trained accordingly, all those coming up through the ranks, maybe no longer have to have special training on the geographic peculiarities of Southwest Portland. There are enough geographic peculiarities as it is. So we could eliminate one of them and make sure that we are doing the utmost to provide safety to our residents of our city. The people in front of you have worked long and hard on this proposal, and I'm really pleased to be able to bring this proposal forward to council for consideration today and hopefully action next week to make this a reality. And I think with that, I will turn it over to Andrew Abbey, who has done a lot of work on this.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Saltzman. I'm Andrew Abbey, South Portland Addressing Project Manager. Wanted to introduce my colleagues here at the table. On my far left is Captain Mike Krebs of the Portland Police Bureau. To his right is Don Rust, Deputy Fire Chief for Special Operations. And to my immediate left is Larry Palat with the Procurement Services. And then on my right is Dan Diaz, who is the Economic Development Director of the City of Hillsboro, who is just now wrapping up a very major street renaming and addressing change in Hillsboro. So Sue, if we could switch to the presentation. So the last time that the City of Portland went through a major street renaming ordinance was in 1931 in the Great Depression, and that ordinance provided for what we now know today as North, Northwest, Northeast, Southeast, and Southwest Portland. And you can see from that's actual script from the ordinance in 1931. You can see at the time there was so little population in what we're proposing to be South Portland that it just simply designated that a prefix 0 be put in front of the addresses on east-west streets. One thing I wanted to point out on this slide is one of the most important things that this ordinance did was not only to set up the 5 addressing sectors, but also to establish a uniform set of addressing. So in other words, street names don't change every few blocks in the city of Portland. And that foresight of our forebears in 1931 has helped make Portland what it is today, which is a city that in most areas is very easy to find your way around. That green line that you see on the map is Burnside, and you can see that Burnside is a contiguous street, including a bridge over the Willamette River, carries the same name all the way from the Washington County border into Gresham. It does not change street names along the way. If you look down on the lower left-hand corner of this slide, you can see that our neighbor immediately to the west, the city of Beaverton, did not adopt this principle when they were extending their streets as part of the growth of their city. And you can see that there are 3 parallel streets there that in the space of 2 miles have between 3 and 4 street names, which is very confusing. So this is the logo that we developed for the new addressing sector that we're proposing come into existence in May of 2020, which is South Portland. So it's important to note that this project did not initiate with the city. It initiated by citizens of South Waterfront as we were doing outreach several years ago in South Waterfront on what became the South Portal project. We got a lot of feedback from residents in the area that the leading 0 was very confusing, particularly for visitors. So since the South Portal resolution was adopted in December of 2016, we've done a lot of staff work and a lot of outreach with the community, including 4 open houses and also briefing the Sweeney Transportation Committee on these changes. So this slide shows you kind of dramatically how much growth there's been in the area. So I worked on the Portland Aerial Tram Local Improvement District in the beginning of my career here at the city. When we formed that LID, we had 78 tax lots in what is now known as South Waterfront. By the time that we closed out that LID 3 years later, the number of tax lots had increased from 78 to 342. And since then, there's been a lot of development, and there have been thousands of new residents added to South Portland. Part of the timing of bringing this ordinance before you today is to get in front of future development so that we don't have more people moving into South Waterfront and also grappling with the leading 0 issue. But the problem is not only in the South Portland neighborhood, South Waterfront, we also have a very confusing leading 0 addressing boundary in Collins View. It's actually an imaginary line. It doesn't go down, in all cases, down the middle of a street. It hops across the east fence of a cemetery in Collins View. It skirts across backyards. It is just simply not intuitive. You don't know when you're inside or outside of the leading 0 area. So one of the principles that we used when we were laying out the future boundary of South Portland is we wanted the boundary to be intuitive, we wanted it to be based on a landmark, and we wanted it to be a straight line. So I've showed you a map there. State of Idaho, among other states, borders Montana and Wyoming. We wanted that border between South and Southwest Portland to look much more like the Idaho-Wyoming border, i.e. a straight line down Viewpoint Terrace, as opposed to this curvy, crooked, imaginary line between Idaho and Montana that isn't intuitive to people. And on Viewpoint Terrace, once this goes into effect, on the east side of the street, you'll have a street name sign with South, and on the west side of the street, you'll have a street name sign with Southwest.
And what will Viewpoint Terrace be?
Viewpoint Terrace will remain southwest, similar to how Williams Avenue is North Williams Avenue and divides north and northeast Portland. And thank you, Commissioner, because that was a perfect segue into the next slide. So as we were sitting down with the Bureau of Development Services and reviewing our building code, what we also realized is that the building code has withstood the test of time quite well, But as some new streets were created in the Rose Quarter area, the building code was not followed. So if you look at this map here, we have a very small segment of the boundary between North and Northeast Portland. You can see that dash red line. That's the imaginary southerly extension of Williams Avenue, which makes a little bit of a jog there as you approach your Rose Quarters southbound. And you can see those properties that are shaded in purple. That is actually the east half of the Rose Garden. So depending on which side of the Rose Garden you're sitting in, the west side of the Rose Garden is technically, according to this, North Portland, and the east side of the Rose Garden is Northeast Portland. But obviously, we assign single addresses to properties. We're not proposing to readdress any existing buildings. We just simply want to move this line from that imaginary dash red line over to the green line immediately adjacent to Interstate 5. And so both the purple and the red areas there will officially be North Portland. And the green line then becomes North Williams Avenue instead of changing street names every couple of blocks similar to what they have in Beaverton. So I wanted to just recap for you, why are we doing this? What are the project objectives?
Excuse me, Andrew, just before you go on, I don't see that change.
Did you want to go back to the last slide, Commissioner?
Well, just a question about the change from northeast to north. That's not in the title of either of the ordinances.
Pardon?
The changing of that sections from northeast to north.
Yes.
It's not in the title of any of either of the matters before us today.
It's not in the title, but it's in the body of the ordinance.
And do the people who use that area know about it?
These streets here are primarily used by TriMet. It's really the access through the Rose Quarter Transit Center. And TriMet's been fully informed on that, and they've indicated that they're supportive of the change. There are no buildings addressed off to these streets. They're basically circulatory streets through the Rose Quarter.
Thank you. Now, has the Neighborhood Coalition been informed?
We did not involve the Neighborhood Coalition. Really, Commissioner, what we were doing is the building code already sets forth that Williams Avenue is the dividing line, so we're really just making the street naming coming into conformance with the building code.
Thank you.
So in terms of the project objectives, I'll just run through these briefly. So we wanted to eliminate the extra step that the 911 dispatchers currently have to do, where somebody's on the phone, they could potentially be from a leading zero area. They may actually be in the future Southwest Portland that remains, but the dispatcher still has to take extra time to make sure that they're not calling from the leading zero area. We were trying to eliminate addresses incorrectly reported by customers. We're really trying to eliminate the human error. And as I mentioned on the last slide, we're just simply trying to bring the addressing boundary in alignment with the building code chapter. And I think another important aspect of this is we're trying to avoid future situations where we don't know what the next information technology upgrade is going to be. It may be the permitting system, it may be the Water Bureau billing system, it may be the police citation system. We're just trying to make it so that we don't have to spend money in the future to pay a software vendor to reprogram an information technology system to work with the leading zero. And on my left, Larry Palat was going to talk a little bit about what that would look like for procurement services.
Good afternoon. I'm Larry Palat, Procurement Services. Part of the problem with this particular thing is that we would very likely end up with a sole source technology type of upgrade if we had to go there. The issues with that, especially with sole source, is they're very difficult to manage and they're difficult to control costs in, and you end up in a situation where you may think you've bought something off the shelf, but it doesn't perfectly work, so then you end up with a lot more money invested in them, trying to make sure that they tack on to every other system that the city already has in place. Then with future upgrades to city systems, you end up with additional money tied to this one vendor with basically no capacity to compete it or control the costs in that manner, and you have to continually upgrade it, maintain it, and continually rebuild that so that it always stays consistent with everything else the city does. So especially sole source. Technology procurements by themselves are a little bit tricky and sometimes difficult to manage, and when you put them into a context of a sole source, it makes them even more difficult.
Thank you, Larry. And just to recap the bottom of the slide, this is some property owner testimony that I thought was very compelling. This is a property owner whose address will change to south, and he is a retired employee of the U.S. Geological Survey. He said the project is long overdue. A leading zero in an address simply does not work today. A zero is not used in front of a whole number or in any other scientific, business, or common use. The era when a city or business could afford to develop customized software is past. The city has chosen to avoid future costly customized software changes by investing in the hardware, in this case, new street signs. So I'm not going to read all of these, but these were the guidelines that we used. There's about 150 addresses out of the 9,600 that are getting more major changes. And these are the principles that we used in assigning those new addresses. I should add that a couple hundred of the 9,600 are really just placeholder addresses for vacant properties, including those ones you saw in the Rose Garden, and those will receive new addresses at the time of future development. What was also very interesting is we had approximately 150 owner addresses in the leading zero, where when those people bought their properties and put down their mailing address with Multnomah County, they left a zero off of it. So we actually have residents of the future South Portland that are not using the leading zero in front of their address to reinforce what Commissioner Saltzman said in his opening remarks. I just wanted to show you, this is a slide I took. I went out one day to Beaverton to just take a picture of the different street signs. In this case, if you leave Washington Square, you go down Greenway, which turns into Brockman, which then turns into Beard, and then it turns into Nora. As I was going through the Murray Boulevard intersection, I was an unfortunate passerby to a vehicle making a left turn and running into a motorcyclist. The fire station down the street responded very quickly. They knew what they were doing. What this made me realize, though, is somebody unfamiliar with the area who might be calling in that incident would not know whether they were at Hall and Greenway or whether they were at Murray and Beard or Murray and Greenway. There's any one of a number of different combination of street names. So really, I just wanted to show this to reinforce to council that one of the wisest things that our forefathers did in 1931 was just to have a uniform addressing of a particular street, contiguous street along its entire length. This is some of the feedback that we have received on the leading zero since we rolled it out. I just wanted to show you that on the top example, I was setting up a meeting with the South Portland Business Association. I was trying to get an idea as to a coffee shop at which we could meet. So I went into Google and I typed coffee 97239. The first thing that popped up was a coffee shop where they left off the leading zero, and the address that was indicated was 12 blocks out of direction. We didn't actually wind up meeting there, but my point being is that Google doesn't even always get the addresses right. So we got a comment from a North Portland resident. He said, "I've always felt a bit lopsided. It will be nice to have a counterbalancing segment of South Portland." The middle piece of testimony there is from a UPS driver who is solidly in favor of this change. And then there's one there at the bottom that just talks about the different GPS problems with the leading zero addressing. And then moving on to slide number 11, this is how South Portland fits into the remainder of Portland. And one of the questions that I got quite a bit during the outreach process is, why do we even have leading zeros? The reason we have leading zeros is because the Willamette River curves pretty significantly to the east. If, for example, you go to the Milwaukee City Hall, its back door is on Southeast 21st Avenue, and the Willamette River at that point is about a mile out of direction. And Milwaukee is across the river from Riverdale, which is among the areas that are included in this street renaming and address change. The largest leading zero address we have is on Military Road, which is 24 blocks east of NATO Parkway and Viewpoint Terrace. And fundamentally, the reason we have leading zeros is because we could have established the address numbering in 1931 to start at that point in Riverdale, but had that happened, City Hall would no longer be on 4th Avenue, City Hall would be on 28th Avenue, and it would be a little confusing because you'd be in downtown Portland and wonder where the other 24 blocks went. So, full disclosure, I am a former Leading Zero resident myself, so I've grappled with some of these issues. But all of these examples that I just wanted to show you, these are not from me. This is actual feedback from Leading Zero residents. Another package was delivered to the wrong address. I had to give the police directions when reporting a fight. I had to cancel my credit card because their database couldn't handle the Leading Zero. I give out the Leading Zero. People think it's a typo and take it out. I tell people Leading Zero. They ask me, what do you mean zero? And one of my favorites is, I was doing business with a company earlier this year, and they sent me an email with a little email string on the bottom where they listed a fake north-south address. And they said, go to this address and look around the corner and look for this colored door, and that's our real address, but the GPS can't find us. And
although to be fair, that's the
pardon?
same to be fair, that's the same
Yeah.
for a lot of Southwest Portland.
Yeah. So then the top one on this page is really my all-time favorite, which was the Leading Zero was dropped, and a gas line was cut at my nearby neighbor's backyard instead of my house. We have two houses on the same block, which, but for the zero, they're the same number. So the gas line got cut at the wrong house. Next one down, the property owner at 202 has a sign in front of their house saying not 20202 to avoid packages being delivered to the wrong address. Fake letter 0 at the beginning of the address. UPS won't take the address, use some other carrier to deliver your packages. And then finally, that little slide that I showed there on the bottom is a really egregious example of the addressing being wrong on a street in Riverdale, where you have a 1900 across the street from a 200 that doesn't have a Leading Zero. So the pink properties there at the bottom of the slide are actually 21 blocks away from where GPS would expect to find it. So now I wanted to just take you to a slide. This is a picture of our 911 dispatch center in Southeast Portland. When we started working on this earlier this year, we actually had a situation where our Vesta telephone software did not recognize a Leading Zero address. So when there was a bunch of testing going on, if you called from a non-Leading Zero address, the address would populate on the dispatch screen, but if it was Leading Zero, it wouldn't work. And I wanted to just turn this over to Captain Krebs and Don Russ, and they could share some perspectives from an emergency response point of view. Mike?
Let me go first. Good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. I'm Mike Krebs, Portland Police, and I moved here in 1992, and I was going through my coaching. You go through the coaching program with the Portland Police, and it was very confusing for me. I'd never heard of this Leading Zero before, and I actually missed a couple different addresses when I was responding to calls. They weren't emergencies, so no one was impacted by it, but it can be confusing. And a concern that I have is that in an emergency situation, oftentimes people revert back to, what they've been doing over and over again. And we don't get that many calls down here. So if you haven't worked this area for, 4 or 5 years and you get a call down there, it's potentially you could miss an address. And I think, as Commissioner Salzman said, is that time is of the essence on some emergencies. I'm also concerned, too, a little bit about if someone's not familiar with the area, maybe they're visiting, and they come down and see some kind of crime in progress, they make a phone call to dispatch, they find themselves having this conversation over the phone about, okay, does it have a 0 on the front or not? And so I think it's, I'm in favor of this. I think it's anything we can do to make it simpler for the police and fire personnel to respond, I think is a good idea. And I think it serves the community best when we can get there in emergencies without any kind of confusion. So that's all we have to offer.
Thanks.
Mr. Mayor,
Do you need the
Commissioners.
PowerPoint, Andrew?
Oh, question.
Do you need the PowerPoint on?
Yeah, it's still up there.
Do you want to do it? Sue, can we put the PowerPoint on the people testifying, please? Or the screen? Yeah. There.
Thank you. And then Don Russ also just wanted to offer some comments as well from the dispatching point of view.
Yeah, Don Russ, Deputy Chief, Portland Fire and Rescue. I work closely with Chief Myers. Mr. Abbey approached us about a year ago. We had a meeting with Multnomah County Sheriff's Office, BTS. Chief Myers was there, and He outlaid the issues they had in the proposal to create the South Section at the time. Portland Fire and Rescue, we rely heavily on Bureau of Emergency Communications in the VCAD, the computer-aided dispatch system that we purchased about 7-8 years ago. So we rely heavily on technology. It wasn't always that way. I've been in for 35 years. I was fortunate. I didn't have to drive a lot, drive the apparatus at Station 4, Station 10. Back then, we didn't have a real transient workforce. Individuals went to a station, our members or firefighters, and they stayed there. And they had awareness, and they were very intimate with the fire management areas they worked in. But I always remember a couple times doing have to drive, and we'd have to have a map drill. The officer would make us familiar with that area, and it was always a confusing area of having the leading zero. And so here we are today, and we still have the issue. And Mr. Abbey approached us, said the south waterfront is growing, and so there is a possibility if we haven't solved the problem yet, it could get more significant. And now we have a much younger workforce, as Commissioner Salzman said, for cost reasons, and we like to, we have a lot of succession and attrition planning. We're hiring much more, but we thrust these individuals, these younger firefighters, into driving positions. Granted, we rely on the technology we have now. We have mobile data terminals that are connected to a 4G air card that will give us a map. It'll show a dot where we're going if the address is validated correctly. Okay, we don't have automatic vehicle route recommendation where, like, your phone will show you the line to go to. That's coming. But none of that will work if we don't validate the address correctly, and there is a human element at the dispatching center. I'm still a member of the dispatch committee. I managed the fire liaisons up there. Commissioner Salzman, I believe at the time back in 2000, managed BOAC back then, and I was a fire liaison then. I remember the problem then. And the point I'm making, there is a line choice that comes up with a few of these addresses that do occur, and this is a low probability, but it is a high risk. If there's some seconds involved here with a serious cardiac arrest or a high hazard event. And another element to think about is that the areas to where we could have the duplication does have a freeway between it. So if these resources are dispatched to the wrong side of that freeway, it is going to take a lot of time to turn these resources around and get other resources to that area. So on behalf of Portland Fire and Rescue and Chief Myers, we support this initiative.
Thank you, Don. And just to add to what Don said, at our third open house, we had a neighborhood police officer there, and he was listening to the 911 calls on his earpiece. He mentioned to me that he got a call for a 600 block of Southwest. It was a heroin overdose. And about a minute later, the call came in, nope, we dispatched to the wrong place. It's the 0600 block. I don't know much about heroin overdoses, but I know that second counts when you're trying to respond to something like that. So the last thing I just wanted to show you on the slide before I move on is, we can spend unlimited amounts of money to try to get the technology to work, but that still doesn't fix the human error element of the equation. So this is a map. We have multiple response agreements in areas, for example, like Riverdale. So this isn't just an issue for Portland Police and Portland Fire. We have, for example, Lake Oswego Fire Department that responds into this area, and they have to contend with the leading zero as well. And then here are some examples of some of the address changes that will be coming about. I'm not going to list them all here, but you can see that the majority of these address changes, they're really dropping the zero and dropping the W. We have very few major changes out of about 9,600 addresses. We have approximately 150 that have a more major change, and I'll explain more on that in a minute. The companion ordinance with this is I reviewed all of the street names in the city of Portland and found 2 streets that have been misspelled, and so we're taking this opportunity to clean those up. Martin will get an S on the end, and Radcliffe will get an E on the end. And this, I passed out, or actually Sue passed out a double-sided copy of this map to you before council started. These 2 maps, front and back, these are the epicenters of the Bermuda Triangles of addressing in Portland. This is where people go and get lost trying to get to where they're trying to go. I talked to a gentleman a couple weeks ago. His address is so badly geocoded that when he has visitors coming to his house, you have to go stand at the nearest intersection and wait for people to arrive and flag them to get to his house. So these are some of the problems that we're trying to eliminate. And then this is just an overview of the timeline here. So if council approves this ordinance, we will roll out the new South Portland in May of 2020. We will dual sign for 5 years, at which time the Southwest Portland street sign will be removed. And with this slide, I wanted to turn it over to my colleague Dan Diaz from the city of Hillsboro. I'll just kind of give an intro on this slide and he'll make some remarks. City of Hillsboro is wrapping up a much worse addressing problem. So this is a stretch of what used to be Baseline Road in Hillsboro, and it used to be driving from west to east. You went from 22950 west to 6956 east to 22135 east to 7400 west, all in the span of less than a mile. So what we're doing is just much simpler by comparison. I've got a picture there that I took of the gentleman whose mailbox is changing from 22135 east to 7215 with a different street name. So Dan, you want to just tell us a little bit about Hillsboro's experience?
Thank you, Mayor and Councilors. Again, Dan Diaz from the City of Hillsboro, and here mostly for support. You are not the only entity that has experienced this. As Mr. Abbey mentioned, we are in the final stages of this, but we had about 1/5 of our community that was off primarily of a Portland grid system, whereas the other 4/5 of our community had been off of Hillsboro's original grid, which was more centralized to the historic downtown area. And with that, we had to work with a significant portion of our community, about 11,000 homes and businesses combined out of about 55,000 address points total, to work in changing multiple elements of the address, the house or building number, in some cases the prefix, as was pointed out just a moment ago, in some cases the street name, as was also highlighted a moment ago, and we also, which I will not get into too much depth today, had city code issues as well. We had some addresses that were actually Beaverton in the city of Hillsboro, which added a completely different level of confusion and complexity than perhaps a leading zero may. But we experienced very similar challenges and concerns. Obviously, these type of efforts have significant impacts in terms of the community, in terms of requiring them to change addresses. And we worked with our community, both the businesses and the residential entities, in terms of transition plans to try to accommodate changeover of addressing. Businesses, for example, sometimes have very complex logistical reasons and shipment orders as well that they have to go through their logistics chains to update as well. So we took that into account, I think in a similar vein, and you've actually taken it a step further to give additional time and accommodation to that, but really to allow this level of a change to both roll out, but do so recognizing the implications to the community, but also recognizing that if it's not addressed now, it does continue to increase itself with growth, and that's very much a commonality that we experienced and why we made the call as well. One last piece I'll just highlight on as to why we did it is very much in the same vein of public safety and delivery of services was a confusion poised with us. And as I mentioned, it wasn't just a leading zero, it was across multiple segments of multiple addresses. And so with that, definitely understand the position you're in, definitely understand also the positions that both the community has stated and your staff have stated, and wish you the best of luck with that effort.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. We're now on the home stretch of this. So this slide just shows you a recap of how many intersections we're proposing to change in the city of Portland. It's just a little over 1%. It's a large geographic area, but you have a lot of open space, cemeteries, et cetera. So it's a little over 1% of the intersections in the city of Portland. This is a recap of the number of property owners affected. Roughly 3/4, 4/5 of the change is South Portland Neighborhood Association. And then you have the River Place area of downtown, and then Collin Few is right behind it in terms of neighborhoods that have the most benefit from this change. And then my final slide here is, this is a very important slide, is I really want to emphasize that the $305,000 that we want to budget for this, if council approves this is not a new expense. The vast majority of street signs that we have in this area do not meet current engineering standards. As you can see from this slide, some of these street signs have faded so badly over the years that they're pretty much illegible. In some cases, even newer street signs were fabricated without the leading zero addressing on it. So the question I've always asked is, if we forget to put the leading zero on a street sign, I'm not exactly sure how a visitor to Portland is supposed to know that there's a leading zero there. So really, the business case for this, aside from customer services, we would rather spend money on replacing our depreciated assets, i.e. failed and incorrect street signs, than when we would to do what Larry was talking about, is not knowing where the next IT system is that will break with the leading zero and having to spend more money on a Band-Aid for that. And just to give you a real-life example, in the past year, council approved a contract amendment. It wasn't a brand-new software system. It was an amendment to a contract for a software interface that was $340,000, which is more than what we're proposing for the street sign for South Portland. So that concludes my presentation. Happy to answer any questions you have. I believe we have some invited testimony and property owner testimony. Thank you for your time.
So is that Southwest Bond on the black? Is that the new standard for street signs?
Yeah, that's the new standard in terms of the font, and the color is unique to South Waterfront. Yeah.
I've noticed that PBOT has been changing the street signs anyway to make them larger and more easy to read. So some of these, like the ones other than the Bond one, would be replaced anyway.
They would, Commissioner. I think the main thing is that our street sign replacement budget is so small that it would take us a very long time to get these changed out, and we're not completely keeping up with the deterioration in our assets. I know you've heard that before, but we don't budget enough for street sign replacement.
I wasn't aware that the Bureau was planning to do it anyway, and so as somebody with fading vision who's really appreciated the larger street signs, I've been thrilled with how many have been going up. So I think this is another good reason to keep doing it.
And to your point, Commissioner, what we don't want to do is to waste money by going into South Waterfront and putting up leading zero street signs and then coming back several years later. If for some reason you didn't approve this now and then having to replace them a second time to get rid of the leading zero.
Andrew, can I just ask you a question as a history buff? I remember a number of years ago when some signs were changed in Forest Park, the old signs ended up for sale up at the Botanical Garden and at the gift shop at the Rose Garden, and apparently there was a pretty healthy market for them, and I actually have one in my office. What is PBOT's policy on old historic signs?
Yeah, that is a very good question. I have to say I'm an alumnus of Lewis and Clark College, and so I'm trying really hard to get one of the old Palatine Hill Road street signs.
I bet you if we...
There's a market for it.
I bet you there's a market for them, and we could put them online or sell them through the Botanical Garden or something and make a little money.
Yeah, and I'm assuming the council would rather fund this effort partially through the sale of old street signs than to form a local improvement district to pay for the new street signs. So.
All right, now it's just getting late. You have another panel, is that correct, Commissioner?
No, I think it's public testimony.
Very good.
And I think we have some invited testimony.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. We do have an invited panel of Lewis and Clark, Collinsview neighborhood.
Yeah, so we have Alex Nato, OHSU, Lewis and Clark, Collinsview, and South Portland.
Great.
Very good. Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it. Larry, you must be getting tired of us this week. Perfect.
But I love it.
Good. Glad to hear it. Good afternoon. So those of you coming up to testify, please just state your name for the record. We don't need your address unless for some reason you want to give it to us. And if you are a lobbyist, we need that information, of course. Nope.
I think we're going to call you up first.
I don't know how many of us you want.
But we can do two. We could do two teams of three.
Right.
Start.
And just about these are very sensitive microphones, so about 6 inches is right, and they, of course, slide around.
Okay.
Great,
good afternoon, Mayor Wheeler and council members. My name is Len Michon. I live in South Waterfront. I'm also representing the South Portland Neighborhood Association, which comprises Lair Hill Historic District, Johns Landing, the Macadam Plan District, and South Waterfront District. As a board member on the SPNA, we have concluded that we are fully in support of this change. We have had discussions with various residents about their concerns. Of course, the big concern is money. In some cases, we're talking of maybe $1,000 or $2,000 for people to change their addresses with their correspondence. But based upon the issue, the main issue, I think, really is the safety. And quite frankly, I am very much concerned about this. I had an incident, not in this locale, but my wife had a medical emergency, and if it were not for, shall we say, very good neighbors, something calamitous may have happened, just because of the fact that at the time, I don't think I could have made the appropriate address call. So I think that's one of the reasons that we really should be looking at this as a very positive change. I think that's it for me.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mayor Wheeler, Commissioners. My name is Alex Nadeau. I'm the grandson of Bill Nadeau, for whom Nadeau Parkway is named after. I was asked to say a few words on behalf of my family. I think my Uncle Bob gave some testimony earlier on this issue in support, and so I'd just like to reiterate his comments and our family supported this. Personally, the Nadeau Parkway Street is a great source of pride for me and my family, and a great reminder for what my grandfather did and for the city and how much he loved the city. So we are honored that Nadeau Parkway will be an integral part of this new area of Portland, and I think my grandfather would be proud to be a part of it. He was, obviously big on development and growth of Portland, and obviously the safety of its residents. So I actually know that he would be in support of this because my grandmother, his wife, lives in what will be South Portland. So anything that makes her safer, I'm sure he would be a fan of, and I support as well. So thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Harrison. I work at Oregon Health and Science University. Registered lobbyist, I think I have to say that, but full-time employee of OHSU.
Thank you.
Literally, we have thousands of different unique documents. There must be 1 million pieces of paper with our existing address. So it's no small challenge to, over time, phase out all the existing pieces of paper, update all the websites, patient information, directions, et cetera. But all that said, we also have about 50,000 children and adults are brought to OHSU every year to our emergency department. And so we're very acutely aware that even a small matter of minutes can make a significant difference, life or death, or functionality of a patient over time. So we're not hesitant in our support for this change. On just one small personal note, I was the first family member to arrive at Adventist after my grandfather had a stroke a few years ago. And the neurologist on duty was very interested in knowing exactly when the symptoms were first noticed, because a few minutes one direction or another, and he wouldn't be eligible for a blood clotting drug. We were just a few minutes on the right side of that time, and he regained all of his both physical functioning and his neurological functioning were unimpaired. A few minutes different, and that would have changed everything. So personally and professionally supportive. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mayor Wheeler and Commissioners.
Is your mic on?
No, how about now?
There
Better?
you go.
Okay.
Much better.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor Wheeler and Commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to address you regarding this piece of city business. My name is Roy Kaufman. I serve as Director of Public Relations at Lewis and Clark College. I'm also a member of the college's Emergency Management Steering Committee, which is tasked with developing and maintaining the college's planning and preparations for a variety of emergent situations, ranging from isolated events like an active shooter to non-isolated events like an earthquake. When PBOT Program Manager and Lewis and Clark alumnus Andrew Abbey reached out to us to educate us about this proposed address change, we had our share of questions and concerns. Why the change at all? What will it cost us? How much time do we have to comply, or are there alternatives we can seek? And then how will we ever survive without a zero at the front of our address? Andrew made the time to discuss the proposed changes to South Portland addressing with various members of our community. As a result, we feel well-informed and consequently able to testify in favor of the project. The anticipated improvement to the safety of our campus community is extremely important to us. Our Collinsview campus houses approximately 1,800 undergraduates during the school year, with the total campus population exceeding 3,000 people on any given weekday. From our understanding of the project and the presentation today, one of the objectives is to improve emergency first responder response times by reducing confusion around existing numbering. We also had concerns about the costs and timeline associated with the change. PBOT explained the 5-year transition period, providing us ample lead time for implementation. And PBOT also worked with us to select preferred addresses for our law school and our president's residence, which we very much appreciate. We appreciate the thought that has gone into the planning and implementation of this project. We want to thank the city and Andrew for proactively seeking comment and addressing our concerns along the route. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Andrew, was there another invited panel?
Yeah, I think we were going to have the board members of Collinsview come forward.
Very good. Come on up.
Matt and I were having this discussion. I thought it was Potter.
Welcome. Same drill, name for the record, if you don't mind, and about 6 inches to the mic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go right ahead. Okay. I'm Mary Ellen Reed from Collinsview. I'm speaking as a private resident of Collinsview.
Thank you.
I'm not here to address the objectives of the Leading Zero Address Project. I think the public's health and safety and the need of the first responders to have a reliably efficient 911 system overrules any personal inconveniences of address or nomenclature changes. I am testifying as to our experiences with the process as this project unfolded in Collinsview and the surrounding neighborhoods, including Riverdale. The really hands-on leadership by project managers Andrew Abbey and Deputy Fire Chief Don Russ was an outstanding demonstration of government work at its best, as it should be, as a participatory and inclusive process. Fire Chief Mike Myers was similarly so very effective in collaborating and integrating with PBOT. Andrew worked many, many hours with our neighborhood association, especially with our transportation chair, Prakash Joshi, to address, so to speak, and adjust boundary and other issues. Andrew and Don's presentations to the neighborhood somehow managed to be both concise and comprehensive. Much time was invested in this personal outreach. They listened to residents' questions and complaints and answered them factually and respectfully. Very effective rant control, incidentally. Neighborhood activists are a verbal bunch with many questions and strong opinions. The sense leaving the Collinsview meeting was that we were advised with straight information, that our perspectives were being sincerely considered, and that we had access to the project managers if we had further questions or concerns. Mandated change is seldom easy. The city's massive comprehensive changes are in the works, generating rancorous hearings and online discussions, and residents seem to be expressing frustration and feel under siege, unheard. The time Andrew and Don invested in the Leading Zero Project's outreach to really listen, to really solicit ideas, to fine-tune and be willing to accommodate made a huge difference. Their distinctive direction of this project was a declaration and an affirmation that the city can recognize that each neighborhood has its own unique demographic and geographic challenges, and on a personal level, that individual voices can be heard and do matter. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Mayor, can I just make an observation?
Commissioner Fish.
First of all, thank you for taking the time to come and speak glowingly of city employees. We often hear the other side of the ledger when people come to council complaining about one thing or another. But the other thing that I think is noteworthy is Andrew Abbey has some of the hardest assignments in this building. But you would never know it because by the time they come to us, they're cooked and they have broad support, and there may be an occasional remonstrance, and I'm still not sure what that means, but there's occasionally a dispute that needs to be resolved. But the reality is all the work he does upstream, informing, educating, tacking, engaging, is what makes it a pleasure when these matters come to us. And I thank you. You're not the first person, you won't be the last, but I thank you for taking the time to acknowledge what real public service is about.
Yes, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I would support that. My name is Elise DeLister, and I'm the chair of Collins View. And I would say that that was an incredible explanation of the process that we viewed as CVNA organization as well as a resident. The thoroughness and the description that she has supplied you is detailed and absolutely accurate. So thank you for that. Mayor Wheeler and City Commissioners, I had the great opportunity to work with Andrew Abbey, the City of Portland Transportation Department, and Deputy Fire Chief Don Russ, and along with CVNA citizens in the communication process of presenting the South Portland Addressing Project. Change often brings the opportunity for communication that includes addressing fears, frustration, and often anger. During the neighborhood forums that I attended, Andrew and Don met these challenges with precision and excellence. Don's communication skills enabled neighbors to know that their concerns were being heard, while he provided information and education that produced a better understanding of the necessities and benefits of the addressing project. Andrew's ability to generate tools to assist neighbors with the transition, problem solve new issues that would continually present, resulted in change and improved outcome of the acceptance at the end of each forum. I appreciate Andrew's tireless efforts, time, transparency, and solution-based focus as he presented a constant stream of information, answers, and solutions to questions and concerns raised by the CVNA team during this whole process. Our CVNA meetings resulted in support of the process and a full understanding of the necessity of this change. While there was some discussion regarding the process, most concerns raised were regarding the address change transitioning details and support. I appreciate the combined transportation department and fire department approach. Don and Andrew presented a standard of excellence as they communicated and facilitated the essential mapping changes that will improve neighbor safety in a number of neighborhoods. It was a privilege to work with this dynamic duo. And on a personal note, I would say that I found that the city outreach for involving our first responders really created impactful risk management and prevention feedback that really supported this project. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, both of you. Appreciate it.
Mayor Andrew Abbey, before you turn it over to public testimony, what was included in the handouts was an amendment. So BDS made some final changes to the addressing, and I just wanted to respectfully request that council move that amendment and vote on it.
Do we have a motion?
I'll move the amendment.
We have a motion from Commissioner Saltzman for the staff amendment. We have a second from Commissioner Fritz. Why don't we go ahead and take the vote since it's technical?
Fish.
Aye.
Saltzman.
Aye.
Udaley. Aye. Fritz.
Aye.
Wheeler.
Aye, the amendment's passed.
Mayor, before we open to the public, we do have a special guest here. We have Lake Oswego's fire chief, formerly Portland's fire chief. I don't know if he wants to say a few words. Ed? Ed Wilson, right? Ed, do you want to say a few words, or am I mistaking you? Okay. My eyesight's failing me.
Welcome to the club, Dan.
Okay.
We can invite George Passador. He's sort of a celebrity.
Oh, yeah, George. Anyway, we can open up public testimony.
All right, how many people do we have signed up today?
We have
Sue?
7 testifiers today.
All right, very good. So 3 minutes, make sure the green light is on, and once the mic's on, just leave it on for the next person. and the mics slide around, and as I've said, about 6 inches is right. Name for the record, you do not have to give us your address unless you really want to. And under council rules, if you're a lobbyist, a paid lobbyist, please disclose that as well. Thanks, Sue. First three, please.
The first three, please. Richard Risk, Paul Conne, Bob Button, and they'll be followed by Leslie Goss, M. Lehman, and Mari Bauer.
Good afternoon. Welcome. Thanks for being here. Would you like to go ahead and start, sir?
My name is Bob Button, and I'm a resident at 6640 Southwest Corbett Avenue in the area that would become the South Waterfront. And I moved there 3 years ago after spending 28 years in the Bridle Mile neighborhood, and I don't know how many people here have moved in the last few years? Anybody in this room? In that process, I ended up taking 18 months to try to notify all of the various accounts in the area of government, finance, health, insurance, and utilities in order to make all of the changes that were necessary. And it was about 6 to 8 months of having different elements of these various organizations not get the message from the primary organization, followed by credit problems, followed by service problems, followed by delivery problems. My daughter lives in a leading zero location about 8 blocks from where we live down in Johns Landing at this point. And I took the effort to Google some of the leading zero places, and basically Google found them with absolutely no problem whether I left the zero on or took the zero off in terms of finding those. So I was very confused in this process. Actually I want to state that Mr. Abbey made a very great case for this. I had not had the opportunity to hear that case and did not find it online when I went to look for various elements to educate myself about this process. But I think that I would like to say that there's going to be a lot of people who are going to need to have a lot of information to be, if they are in fact forced to change their addresses like this. There is a lot that could be anticipated in terms of helping people, but I would like to say that if there are other alternatives to changing this address system, I first found out about this less than 5 weeks ago. I had not heard anything about it before then. There was a meeting, there was no one at that meeting to provide that education in this process or have that conversation. And I'm still very, very concerned about a 7-year process with 5 years where things appear to have 2 different addresses. So that's my concern, and I wanted to bring them up. I hope that they'll be addressed appropriately. One of the things I did want to ask was perhaps another 6 months is needed to provide more data to a variety of people in the community to really understand where this is going and to get some comparisons about what the opportunities are in terms of how this could be solved.
Thank you. Appreciate your testimony. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to be heard. My name is Richard Risk. I'm president of the South Portland Business Association, and I'm speaking on that behalf. I'm also a leading zero. My office is on Southwest Iowa Street, 0434 Southwest Iowa Street. So I have some knowledge about that issue. The first thing I'd like to point out is the obvious is we have, first of all, Andrew Abbey did an excellent job of pointing out an issue that needs to be addressed by the city, and I want to recognize him for that. And I also appreciate Commissioner Salzman for his focus on the safety and welfare of the citizens of Portland at such a crucial time where that really is a major concern, and you should be commended for that. I want to just point out some very obvious things. We have 2 issues here. Now, one, we have the leading zero issue and the South versus Southwest Portland issue. The people who are businesses in my district are from Lair Hill, Corbett, Johns Landing, and South Downtown. And we are not a cohesive group because of I-5, McAdam, and Barber. We're not one. It's hard for us to organize and make our thoughts heard. Unfortunately, I don't think our thoughts have been heard, even though I generally support, some of my constituents do not, this leading zero issue. So I'd like to talk about 3 meetings. First, I'd like to talk about a meeting I had with Mr. Abbey when he came and was presenting this, And he did admit it was sort of an afterthought, and he had decided these issues and kind of was telling us about it rather than hearing from us. We're concerned about that. There's another meeting that happened at the Hyatt, and was a fairly large group of people who expressed displeasure with this issue and expressed concern over the costs, and I wanted to express that to the commissioner and Mayor Wheeler. And I want to talk about...
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
What are the costs that you're referring to?
Well, there's costs of changing the address for, and a lot of this is small businesses. All the costs from regulatory, and there's actually a memo that we sent all the commissioners and the mayor, rather than use up my time here. It's a May 25th, 2018 memo that sets out our concerns. And basically,
You're not being charged to answer my question. I'm actually interested in hearing from you, and it won't be charged to your time because the clerk has stopped the clock. What are the costs that you want us to be aware of?
Well, specifically, we want to look at, first of the options to this. We want to know that the city has considered options to changing the identity. I mean, this is more than just an address change. You're changing southwest to south. You're changing an area's identity. And so we want to know that the city has considered the costs to businesses and individuals to making these changes. There's a lot of hidden costs. There's too many costs for me to know right now off the top of my head, but we want to know that the city has considered those. And Andrew has done a good job of identifying a problem, but he hasn't really got into the details. I mean, have they considered the alternatives? Are there alternatives in regard to procedural alternatives? For example, using cross streets rather than an address. What options have been considered rather than a wholesale change to the identity of a large group of people? And so what we're asking for here is that, in the meeting we had with Andrew, the deputy fire chief was supposed to come to that meeting and explain to us what the costs were. He unfortunately had a fire. He couldn't do that because of the fire. We never got a chance to hear from him. We're asking that the city delay this decision for a period of 6 months until we've had an opportunity to be heard and know that this is the right option for the city of Portland. Thank you for considering my testimony here.
We appreciate it. Good afternoon. Oh, sorry, Commissioner Fritz.
Thank you. One suggestion I have, I was here on the council when we changed the name of 39th Avenue to Cesar Chavez Boulevard, and one of the concerns, particularly the business associations, was regarding the signage for the businesses. And so I know that we've been increasing funding for Venture Portland, and one thing that you might explore, because it seems to me that's one of the main things, the sign's not going to expire, whereas letterhead and various other paper goods are going to have 7 years to be replaced. That is just a suggestion to look to Venture Portland to see if there might be some small grants to help small businesses to help with changing the signs.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Paul Cohn. I work for the City of Portland. I'm a GIS analyst. I work for the Bureau of Technology Services. For about a dozen years now, I maintain the database of the streets for the city. I also work closely with Bureau of Emerging Communications as well as Bureau of Development Services, the addressing team there, to make sure that addresses as they're created, changed, line up with BOEX systems. And so I worked with Andrew and some with Don, I guess sort of as a technical resource for this project. One of the things, there was a reference to the phone system. I think it was slide 14. I actually took that photo when I was tasked with going out and working to generate a map for that new Vesta phone system that came online in November, I believe it was. That actually system was, Larry Platt was talking about systems that we single source. The single source for that system was State of Oregon Office of Emergency Management. Every PSAP 911 center in the state has that same system now. So we were charged with implementing that last year. One of my first questions to the vendor was, how are you going to make the leading zero addresses map? And it took them a while to answer that. It took them a long while to answer that. I probably spent off and on over several months working with them, about 80 hours of my time, just to make sure that the leading zero addresses will plot correctly on the call taker's map. And that was for 950 or so wireline addresses that are down in South Portland. So 2 weeks of my work just for under 1,000 addresses to make sure they map correctly. So I can't speak for all the bureaus and all the systems that will be impacted by this and all the finances that, the money that could be involved to sort of unwind the leading zero problem that we've had ever since computers came along and before that. But certainly in my work, it's something that we have to figure out every day. We have to make sure that those things work correctly. And so it was just my work as an example of that. So thank you.
So that's very good feedback. And I want to make sure that if this goes forward, you are integrated into this process. So are you at the table?
I've been working with Andrew quite a bit, sort of providing a technical resource and also to BDS as well.
Good. And as you know, I appreciate your expertise, and I particularly appreciate the work you've been doing with the Bureau of Emergency Communications, and I want to make sure that continues if that is the case.
Will do.
Yeah,
thank you.
Appreciate it, all three of you. Thanks for your testimony. Next three, please, Sue.
The next three, please come up. Leslie Goss, M. Lehman, Mari Bauer, and they will be followed by Merrill Richmond and Cheryl Beyer.
Very good. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, Commissioners. I'm Leslie Goss. I live at 11888 Southwest Bremen Avenue, which is also known as 11811 Southwest Riverside Drive, in unincorporated Multnomah County between Selwood Bridge and Lake Oswego. I act as a facilitator, for lack of a better term, for the Riverdale Neighborhood Association, using various electronic bulletin boards and social media platforms to share all kinds of information with neighbors and arrange community meetings as needed. In mid-January, Andrew Abbey of Peabot and Don Russ of Portland Fire and Rescue reached out to the Riverdale grade school principal and our neighborhood association to provide a brief overview on the readdressing project for Southwest Portland and the likely impacts to our schools and neighborhood. Riverdale Grade School and the Neighborhood Association agreed to host a meeting on March 22nd for residents to hear a presentation from Mr. Abbey and Deputy Chief Russ about the elimination of zero leading addresses, converting and re-signing to South from Southwest, and the potential for improved emergency dispatch. Mr. Abbey also offered to clean up quirky addresses for our neighborhood residents. For instance, my lot has 2 completely different addresses. So our neighborhood residents are well-educated, high-income, high-caliber individuals with rigorously constructed arguments for or against different issues, and this issue is no different. There's been chatter ranging from great enthusiasm to be part of Portland's historical development. You can like the Sixth Sextant Plan on a Facebook page developed by one of my neighbors. And then we've also had outrage over the onerous inconvenience of an address change with no real benefit to our neighborhood. Most residents understand and agree that emergency response is handled without incident, primarily by Lake Oswego Fire and police departments. I've heard complaint that converting to South from Southwest will create an inconsistent mess on a neighborhood street running along the Clackamas-Multnomah County line. I've also heard the familiar refrain, "Hey, we're not Portland, why are they doing this to us?" So I believe many of these comments that I've heard, comments and concerns, have been addressed in the exhibit to you prepared by Mr. Abbey and his colleagues for this agenda item 574. I can't give you a neighborhood-wide thumbs up or thumbs down on this effort, but what I can do is join the choir here and commend the work and the approach of Mr. Abbey and Deputy Chief Russ. And also Paul Cohn, incidentally, has come to our neighborhood and helped us with some of our quirky addresses. They have been incredibly thorough and articulate throughout this plan. They've been generous with their time during presentations, through emails and phone calls. They've been very responsive to all of my neighbors' inquiries and have taken steps to clean up some of these tricky addresses in our neighborhood. So we are grateful for their service and their clear communications. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I wish you well with this decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Fritz.
Thank you for summarizing input that you've heard from Riverdale folks. What is your new address going to be, and how do you feel about that one?
My new address is going to be Bremen, and I feel good about it because it's where my driveway comes and goes, so that will be convenient for people trying to find my house. I'm not particularly wedded to the W for Southwest, or not. and it will take, there's no denial, it was going to take a long time. My husband is aggrieved that he's going to have to sort out the addresses with, all the people we do business with, but if it's going to mean reliable emergency response for my neighborhood, I can't stand in the way of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mari Bauer. I live in a Leading Zero area. And if this goes through, I appreciate the idea of grants to businesses to help with the costs. You were asking about costs earlier. There's stationary business cards, and the residents, they have to get a new driver's license, passport, et cetera, et cetera. Also, I'm wondering, again, how it seems like Collinsview had a lot of ability to hear about all the ins and outs. I heard about it 5 weeks ago from a letter, and so I feel like I'm a little bit in the dark. But on the, as far as this 5 to 7 year change, I was wondering too how we're going to have 2 addresses for this time, how that's going to work. I like the idea of having that much time for the businesses to transition, but I was just wondering, how do we have 2 addresses? And how does fire, police, and the post office deal with that? And will that be efficient, and will there be still a problem with them going to the right address?
Andrew, do you want to respond to that now or at the end of the testimony? Okay.
I would like to.
Commissioner Fritz.
Because, the same concerns were registered with this 39th Avenue change. And I think what we found was that either address is fine and gets through. And so for things like driver's license, other things, you wait until you have your next regularly scheduled change so you don't have to change it in the meantime. So I will have some questions for staff about specifically for the first responders. Are they going to be able to find both? My understanding is that there's nowhere that's going to be confused with the Southwest numbers. So I'll get some more clarity on that, but it worked out okay in the previous case for the most part.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Appreciate it.
And then our last 2, Merrill Richmond and Cheryl Byer.
Very good. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. My name is Merrill Richmond. I am 3 times affected by this change. Street name, a sequencing change, and the south to southwest. I moved here about 6 years ago from a small town outside of in New York. And one of the things that I enjoyed about that town, there were only about 6,500 people in it, was there was a very strong sense of local control. And when I moved here to Portland, it was one of the concerns that I had. Are you going to feel like you're part of a very dispassionate city? So what I wanted to say today was thank you for being so concerned. The team has been referenced many times. Andrew and his team have been very active with their outreach. I first heard about this change in one of the local papers and then attended some of the meetings that were organized. And because we're affected a couple of times by this, I've had email exchanges with Andrew personally and have been very impressed with the amount of attention that he's given all that. In the spirit of that local involvement, there are 9 houses on Esquilin Circus that are going to be part of a street name change. We're losing our circus, and we're going to become what was proposed to be Esquilin Circus Avenue, which seemed nonsensical. A few of us got together, reached out to the office, put a little 9-person petition together saying, can you please not make Esquilin Circus Avenue a reality as part of this name change? And the informal conversations with Andrew and his team have been very positive. I think that might be part of your amendment. So I just wanted to thank you all for demonstrating how a big city can still be very responsive to local concerns. And thank you for that.
Thank you for coming.
Sir, I've been racking my brain trying to find a town just outside of New York with 6,500 people.
Yeah.
So north, south, or north?
Pleasantville, New York.
Pleasantville, New York.
Yeah.
I grew up just not far from Pleasantville, New York. Small town.
There you go.
Very good. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here, and thanks for sharing that positive message.
Sure.
Commissioner Fritz.
It's a circus, not a circle.
Correct, it's circus.
Yeah.
I live in a zoo, but I live on a circus.
And what distinguishes a circus from any other type of?
Some of the historical experts may know Palatine, Aventine, and Escalon were 3 of the 7 hills of Rome. So maybe Mr. Nato's grandson knows the story. But
bred in circus.
So you had just like Piccadilly Circus.
So is it just a very small segment?
Yeah, there's, I believe, 9 houses.
And there isn't anything further either way, so it's not one of those cases
Palatine on one end and Comus on the other. So,
Okay. All right, so all the history buffs out there, they're going to be sending us emails within the minute. I promise you.
Yeah,
within a minute,
that's
we'll
the
have
street
an answer.
sign you're going to want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a bunch I want, but I'm still negotiating with the transportation secretary.
And as I'm reading the amendments, and it does say that neither street is being renamed in these ordinances, so presumably there is going to be more discussion on that.
Oh, okay.
I would expect that they wanted to put an avenue because of the streets one way being streets and avenues being the other way.
Yeah, the notice from the city indicated that the term circus is not recognized by the Postal Service, so maybe it's part of a standardization. I don't.
Pretty sure it is in Piccadilly Circus.
Yeah.
Thank
All
you.
right, moving right along.
Hi.
Good afternoon. You get the last word on
Oh,
this.
yes, thank you very much. I've listened with great intent. This project has been thought through very carefully and soundly, and I agree with it. But there's been 2 points I've been listening very carefully for, and I'd like some clarification on. A couple people have addressed cost, and as an individual and a former banker, the first thing that popped into my mind is who's going to pay all the filing fees for these plot changes? Trust deeds and all of that, that doesn't happen automatically. Is the city going to put that in their budget, or is the individual going to have to pay for those?
Individual.
So you're asking the residents to pay for the new filing fees, because that's several $100s. Okay, and then the next thing is, I've heard all of the discussion about the preceding 0 addresses. I do not have a 0 in front of my address, and I'm really curious as to why a number was pulled out of the air to change 7 to 65. I don't see a reason for that.
We'll add it to the list for staff when they come on
Okay,
back.
I've been in that house for 48 years. It's unique because it is 1 digit, and unless there's a valid reason to change the number, I would prefer to retain that 7. Like I say, there's no preceding 0 on it. Unfortunately, the people around me have 0s. But we do not, and those are the 2 things that I wanted to address.
Thank you very much. And
Thank you for your time.
Our resident experts are looking at the maps as we speak.
Thank you.
Ma'am, in addition, are you going from being southwest to south?
No. No, everything would be the same. It's just that they would take my number away. And like I say, it's unique. It's historic. I have lived there for so many years. We understood the story as to why the 0, the river changing, and that's one of the things that comes up in conversation every once in a while. It's not like a matter of life or death, but we would prefer to keep that number if possible.
Very good.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks for coming in.
I'm particularly partial to number 7.
Mayor Wheeler, before I start to respond to questions, I just wanted to put a call out. Margaret Lehman had indicated that she was going to testify today, and she wasn't on the sign-up sheet. Just wanted to see if she was here and wanted to testify.
Oh, I did call her.
Okay. All right, so a couple of things. Paul, did you want to come up as well? You're the expert on this. So I think the important thing to know is I have met with U.S. Postal Service. I want to clarify one thing. There's a 5-year dual signage. There is technically not a 5-year dual addressing. So in May of 2020, your address changes. That said, per my meeting with the U.S. Postal Service, the guillotine does not drop the day after we put up the new street signs, that they will continue to deliver mail to the old address. What we have is a 5-year dual street signage system. And Commissioner, you look like you want to ask me a question, but I can also have Paul chime in
Well, I
here.
do. I remember that we got a memo from the postmaster on Chavez.
Right.
That was for longer than whatever the minimum period is. Is it possible to get a memorandum of understanding from them to allow for a little bit longer?
I think I can let Paul address this. The quick answer I would give to preview what Paul's probably going to say is we maintain an alias address record. And Paul, you want to take over and
sure.
Answer the Commissioner's question?
So just speaking to the post office, when we did meet with them, they did indicate that, I believe it's technically 6 months that they maintain that forward, but it would be, it would probably be recognized much longer than that, unofficially. I mean, some of these things depend on who the postal carrier, who's the person who's bringing the mail to your door. Right. Is it the same person who's on the regular route? Is it someone they're bringing in from someplace else who maybe doesn't know the area? So I think they don't want to, post office didn't want to go on record on guaranteeing it longer than 6 months. In regards to what Andrew was referring to with the old versus new addresses for systems like BOEC, what we would do in that case, I feel like this microphone is, am I too close? Okay. What we do in that case is we would maintain, there's 2 ways that addresses get found. They get found by, thank you. They get found by address ranges on streets, but they also get found by individual address points. So we've already started, since I maintain the data, I've already started going in and creating new segments for the South Portland addresses with the new ranges. And then the next step would be and we've created new address points as well. So then going forward, we would have in the system, we would have old and new address points overlapping each other on the map. And so if the old address comes in or the new address comes in, because some vendor hasn't, a telephone vendor, for example, a cell phone company hasn't got their data updated yet, then we would make that happen. In regards to Circus, I did try and get the post office several years ago to recognize that as an approved street suffix, and went all the way to Washington, D.C. and back, and they said no. So
I have an update on Circus. It's a British term, and it is either a large roundabout, a circular arrangement of houses, or an open circle, square, or plaza where several streets converge.
Yeah. And one of the problems with Circus is people might tend to abbreviate it by saying CIRC, which could be confused with circle. And so many, because we often do the street types with 4-letter, there's only 4 fields, 4 letters in that street type field, so it gets confusing.
So you took out Fairview Circus and Luray Circus, but you still got in here the other Esquilin, Aventine circuses.
Yeah, so Commissioner, the idea was that Circus is not recognized by the Postal Service. If we were changing 2 out of the 4 circuses from southwest to south, didn't want to make these people change their addresses down the line. And Postal Service keep their little tickler of all the addresses that bug them. Oregon, Washington, Idaho, they have this little tickler file, and they come talk to us about stuff they want us to change. So this way we're not having to rehash this conversation moving forward.
But they can have Circus Space Avenue.
Yes. Yes.
Sounds like
and
the best we
I just
get.
wanted to respond to the very good question from the Collins Street resident. We decided to do that boundary change in Collins View. We were really trying to get rid of those imaginary boundary lines, and by moving the boundary from mid-block, which is a very confusing place to have addressing boundary change mid-block. You're driving down a block, and the numbers get smaller, and then all of a sudden they start to get larger. We made that conscious decision to have the boundary change at Viewpoint Terrace, and as a result of that, we had a cluster of houses just immediately to the west of Viewpoint Terrace that we had to change. A few of them are southwest today. They'll remain southwest, but we had to change them in order to maintain the proper sequencing. So the way Deputy Chief Don Russ explained it to me, if you're driving a fire truck down the street at 3 in the morning, it's dark, it's foggy, you're looking at the house numbers going down the street, you don't want them to be out of sequence, you want them to be all in order. And I would also add we're doing a fairly major renumbering on Southwest Military Road because it jumps from 5-digit numbers to 4-digit numbers, and as you're driving down the street, all the even numbers are on one side, and then all of a sudden it switches to the other side of the street, which is a violation of the cardinal rule of emergency response, is that odd numbers are always on one side of the street and even is always on the other. So we're just trying to clean up all these, what I called earlier, the Bermuda Triangle difficulties of actually finding your way to addresses in this area.
Andrew, can I make a suggestion? We've had a lot of people express some heartburn about changing addresses, and I think I could write a book about changing addresses. I lived on what used to be called 39th, and it became Cesar Chavez Boulevard. And then I've had a couple of changes in the last 2 years. And the truth is that I'm actually more typical of the typical person in Portland now through all those moves than the other, because people are moving all the time, and they're moving often because they can't afford where they're renting or other changed circumstances. The good news is that some of our systems are getting better to address that. So for example, I learned not long ago that when you contact DMV to update your address on your license, they automatically notify Multnomah County elections, so your address for your voting is updated. I think that must be some legacy of Motor Voter. But that's positive. And then I got a sticker in the mail that I put on my license that was hardly an inconvenience, but that killed 2 birds with 1 stone. I have found in each of my moves that the people that billing me for services were very resourceful about finding my new address. And so I'm heartened to know that they are highly motivated to get it right, and with or without my assistance. I don't run a business, and my wife doesn't run a business out of our home. I will say that one cost, but it's not necessarily a cost to everybody, is getting new checks. I know that a lot of banks offer the least expensive checks are free, but mine have a little trim, so I might have paid $12 for that. But that was not that complicated. Of course, I had to update the addresses of organizations that I contribute to or that my kids interact with. Yeah, that took some time. But the point I want to make is the systems we deal with are getting better to help us do this because people are moving more frequently. And I also found the post office to be incredibly helpful. And the post office people look at the name on the package or the letter and the address. And frankly, the entire time, 20-something years I lived on what's now Cesar Chavez between Knott and Stanton, I don't remember the time a neighbor ever came to my house saying, here's a letter addressed to you that came to our house. So that's of some comfort. But I think it may be worth our consideration providing to the neighborhood associations or on the website just a little cheat sheet on tips that we get from the post office, maybe from an accountant, and people that do a lot of this, on how to update your address in a way that's as easy as possible. Because it is a burden. It comes on top of everything else we do in our life. But perhaps we could offer some helpful hints.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'll be pleased to know we actually were already planning to do that. Elise DeLisser from Collinsview, who testified, had suggested that very thing. And so if council approves this ordinance on June 6th, what we're planning to do within the next month is to send out a confirmation letter to everybody and include exactly that, which is a cheat sheet in terms of what to do to change the address. And I've already started talking to example, Portland General Electric, Northwest Natural, Multnomah Athletic Club, Oregon DMV. I've already started those conversations to make them aware that this is afoot.
You're one step ahead, as always. Thank you.
Thank you.
So what about the issue that Ms. Meyer raised about her house number 7? There are some places in Portland, Mountain Park comes to mind, where the houses are just named numerically starting from 1. And presumably first responders find their way there. Why are we, just because it's more logical, saying, well, they have to be on opposite sides of the street and they have to have the cross street as part of the address?
I think, Commissioner, part of the feedback that I heard from neighborhood residents, this isn't just a bureaucratic thing, it's just, I'll give you a good example. When I was talking to Lewis and Clark, their president's house was numbered out of sequence. And so they would consistently have guests arrive who were looking at the house numbers driving down the street. And the president's house at Lewis and Clark is currently addressed as if it's 2 houses away. So in theory, yes, we could honor that request of the president of Lewis and Clark to keep the old number. He's warmly embracing the new number because he's tired of people getting lost finding his house. So I would throw out a cautionary note of being careful what you wish for, because if we keep the old number and change everybody else, then it's going to lead to wayfinding problems down the line. I would also note that the ordinance allows the Bureau of Development Services the administrative authority to change any addresses after you adopt this ordinance. So we will continue that outreach process if there's a good reason to change it to something different. Basically, what will happen is after council adopts this ordinance, it reverts back to the administrative procedure of BDS assigning the address, and they will have the full capability of doing that.
And have you notified everybody whose number will change?
Absolutely, yes. And I heard very little feedback from the folks that were notified.
Thank you.
And one of the feedback I did hear, by the way, is we're not wedded to the Escalon Circus Avenue, and we should really change it to Escalon Avenue, and that was part of the amendment that you just approved earlier. So we've made a lot of changes based on feedback that we've heard from property owners.
Oh, wait a minute. So you're saying that they are going to be just Avenue, not Circus Avenue?
Correct.
And is that based on all the residents?
Is that based on what?
All of the residents who have a circle?
Oh, I'm reluctant to say all, but there's only like 9 people living on the street, and I'm pretty sure I talked to 5 of them, so I'm pretty sure we have a plurality at that point.
Yeah, there's the signatures for 7 of the 9.
To change it just to Avenue, not Circus Avenue?
Correct.
Okay, because I don't say there's just 9, then you really could have just a group vote, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.
It's nice to have a petition in favor of something I'm proposing rather than against it, so.
Yeah, really. Well done.
Can I just acknowledge also Jeanette Sillick and Lisa Baumgartner from BDS, who are the addressing team back there, who worked a lot with myself and Andrew and had some hair pulling, and probably still will have some, but I appreciate their work as well on this. So.
Thank you. Appreciate it very much, and thank you.
And Lisa Baumgartner was indispensable in assigning all these new addresses, so I want to get that on the record. So.
Great. All right, colleagues, anything else on this before we pass it on? Very good. With regard to item 574, this is a first reading of a non-emergency ordinance. It moves to second reading. With regard to item 575, this is also a first reading of a non-emergency ordinance. It moves to second reading. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Next item, and it's time certain, it is after 3:30. Could you call item 576, please, Sue?
Item 576, authorize a 5-year price agreement with Wells Fargo Bank N.A. for banking services for a not-to-exceed amount of $675,000.
Very good. This is a procurement report. We have Chief Financial Officer Jennifer Cooperman hiding over in the corner, and there's Larry.
Sorry, sir, we weren't hiding, we were waiting for traffic to clear.
Yeah, no, I could see that. You were being patient. Thank you. And Jennifer, are you starting us off today?
Actually, I'm going to let Larry Platt
Very
start us
good.
off.
Thank you.
Are we ready? Good afternoon, I am Larry Platt, Procurement Manager with Procurement Services. Thank you for having us here, Mr. Mayor, Commissioners. This is a report relative to banking services from the Office of Management and Finance Treasury Division for Banking Services. Portland City Council passed Ordinance 188615 on September 27, 2017, authorizing competitive solicitation for banking services. These are services such as receiving deposits, providing checking accounts, and housing our electronic payment system for vendors and employees. Essentially, these are the same services that you and most citizens have in place with a bank or credit union. Because we're a public institution, we're required to use a depository bank which meets the state of Oregon minimum standards and is approved by the Oregon State Treasurer's Public Funds Collateralization Program. This limits the field, if you will, of potential proposers to a very few large banks. On October 3rd, 2017, Procurement Services advertised RFP 748 for banking services. 5 proposals were received and opened on October 30th, 2017. All proposals were responsive to the solicitation requirements. All proposers were evaluated by a team of diverse and qualified evaluators, including a member from the city's Minority Evaluator Program. The city issued a notice of intent to negotiate an award to Wells Fargo on December 11th, 2017. No protests were received. The evaluation process was a 2-step process, which included an evaluation of the written responses as well as a series of in-person interviews. The city used information gathered in the written responses to craft questions for the oral interviews. Wells Fargo scored the highest in the overall evaluation process. As a side note, the fact that Wells Fargo was a current and incumbent vendor did not merit any points in the evaluation process. Wells Fargo has a current City of Portland business tax registration number. They are compliant with all of the city's contracting requirements. OMF Treasury's level of confidence in the cost of the services is high, as the city has over 20 years of historical data by which to determine appropriate costs. Awarding this price agreement to Wells Fargo will allow the city to continue the banking services we currently provide and to continue with the excellent customer service we are known for. It is requested that the City Council approve this report and authorize the Chief Procurement Officer to execute a contract with Wells Fargo for banking services in an amount not to exceed $675,000. If the council has any questions concerning the solicitation or the resulting agreement, I can answer those. Or if there are questions specific to the actual services required or the services or how they work, Jennifer Cooperman, the city's new Chief Financial Officer and Director of Revenue and Financial Services, is here to answer those.
Mayor.
Are you?
Commissioner Fish, then Commissioner Udaly, then Commissioner Saltzman.
Thank you very much. I've received a number of emails and phone calls with some questions. I think it's just helpful in this forum to pose the questions and ask either you, Larry, or the Chief Financial Officer to respond to them. The first was consideration given to contracting with a credit union versus a bank like Wells Fargo?
Credit unions were free to respond to the RFP. We received none. I will just explain that the banking services that we are procuring are pretty vast, and we received 5 proposals from banks that are recognized as national corporate commercial type banks, and the volume of services that we require from our financial institution might not be the ones that a credit union or a smaller local bank is in the position to be able to deliver.
Thank you. Also, I think it would be helpful if you just distinguish for us the difference as you understand it between Wells Fargo's commercial banking operation and its personal banking operation.
So Wells Fargo, like many very large banks, runs separate lines of businesses. And we, as the City of Portland, are serviced by the commercial side or the corporate side of the bank. In addition to that, the bank runs what it calls a personal services part of their institution, and that is the side of the bank that if you walked in to a branch and wanted to open up a checking account or a savings account, or even if you were a small business, you might be serviced by that more retail side of the house. It is a different part of the organization than what the City of Portland is serviced by, since the types of services that we use as a corporation, as a public entity, are very different from what you might use as a checking account holder or a savings account holder. We use services that are designed for businesses, automated clearinghouse payments, positive pay, anti-fraud measures, we have 20-odd different bank accounts, and we move money between those accounts on a daily basis. So the type of service that we are contracting for is very different than what might be sold or would be sold on the personal banking or the retail side of the institution.
So we're on the commercial side of that ledger?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
And I guess my last question, at least in this round, because I'd very much like to hear from my colleagues, is You know, you can barely turn on the TV these days without seeing ads from Wells Fargo and from Uber, essentially making the case that they have made significant mistakes in the past and asking consumers to give them a second, third, fourth chance, whatever. You know, Ms. Cooperman, that any decision we make with respect to this contract will be evaluated both on the substance. Did we run a clean process on procurement? And from the materials that I've reviewed, it was a clean process, no protests, so that answers one side of the ledger. But there's also going to be those who look at the symbolism, not the substance of the decision, but the symbolism of continuing a relationship with a company that has sometimes been in the headlines for the wrong reasons. You're charged with making sure that we remain creditworthy, that we have integrity in our financial decisions, and that we make wise decisions. Based on everything you know about Wells Fargo, why are you recommending that we enter into this contract?
I'm recommending that we enter into this contract with Wells Fargo because Wells Fargo does great work on behalf of the city. We have banked with Wells Fargo, as you said, for over 20 years. It probably is more. We periodically go out for competitive procurements to reevaluate the market, both from a service standpoint and a pricing standpoint, and Wells Fargo continues to do well by the city. The issues that they have been headlined for are ones that we have not experienced on our side of the bank. I can't point to something that we have had an issue with on the corporate side, and if we have, the bank has always been quick to discuss it with us, diagnose it, and remediate it. But there isn't anything that rises to the level, in our experience, like what is going on the retail side of the bank. If I could take a minute, I'd like to briefly walk through what we did in the RFP process. We award 100 points in our RFP process, and 20 of those points are on the corporate responsibility section of the proposer's proposal to us. 40% is based on the services and approach, because at the base level, we want to make sure that whoever we are contracting with can do the services that we need for them to do. 25% of the awarded points are on pricing, 15% are based on references and financial strength, and then there's the 20 points on corporate responsibility. And when we had, so we received 5 proposals. We invited 3 institutions to come in and make oral presentations to us. And we again focused on corporate responsibility when we talked to the vendors at that point. We had on our evaluation committee representatives from Meyer Memorial Trust, from Mercy Corps. We had a member of the Minority Evaluation Program. We had accounting staff and treasury staff. And it was a consensus selection of Wells Fargo to keep as our depository banking partner.
Thank you.
Commissioner Daly.
So I've already gone on record in the past saying that it's my strong preference that we don't do business with Wells Fargo. It's my understanding, unfortunately, that the other 4 applicants or respondents to the RFP have some of the same problematic issues for me as Wells Fargo. I understand that the corporate division is separate from the consumer division, but that's not much of a consolation for me. Neither is the fact that they've revised their ethical standards. They're actually under investigation again for their practices in their wealth management division. But my biggest issue is where they invest their money. That being said, I would like you to share with the public who the other applicants were, and I don't expect you to say this, so I'll just say it. Unfortunately, there is no more attractive alternative than Wells Fargo, because they're all conducting business in the same way.
So as Larry Platt mentioned, the banks that are eligible to bid are banks that participate in the State Treasurer's Qualified Public Depository Program. So the 5 proposals that we received were from Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, US Bank, Key Bank, and MUFG Union Bank.
Oh, I'm not familiar with MUFG Union Bank.
MUFG, Mitsubishi, I forget what the UFG part stands for, but it was, Union Bank was a standalone U.S. bank. They actually have an office downtown and was purchased, so they have different ownership today.
And then my second and final question is whether we're able to do business on a smaller scale with any local credit unions or community banks.
We do business with smaller institutions. We do business with credit unions. The public qualified depository program was expanded in 2012 to allow credit unions to participate. Prior to that, the law was not written to allow them, and it was actually under then State Treasurer Wheeler's guidance that the state law was changed. We do business with those smaller institutions on the depository side, and we have deposits for, I think it's up to 15 institutions right now. That includes some of all of the smaller banks and the credit unions who are interested in having deposits. Not many of them are, because they're required to put up collateral to do that, and there is a cost for doing that. And it isn't necessarily the most attractive deposit for them to hold our money, but we do regularly inquire as to their interest in doing that. And I'll just add that if there are, when there have been institutions that have expressed interest in doing business with the city, in some cases what we have found is that they either don't have the full suite of services that we need, or if they are presenting those services, it's because there's actually one of these banks behind the scenes who is selling it on a generic basis, allowing the smaller bank to put their name on it. And so we're paying for the same service from the same institution, but at a higher price because there's always a spread.
Right. I did actually think of one more question.
Sure.
Could you explain again, just for the benefit of people in the room and people watching at home, what are we are restricted by certain laws and rules. We can't just bank with anyone. So could you maybe, in a nutshell, explain why so many institutions would be excluded out of the gate from responding to that RFP?
So it goes back to the Oregon Revised Statutes, and it's ORS 295 that we are subject to, that tells us as a jurisdiction in the state of Oregon who we can bank with. We can keep up to the FDIC, NCUA insured limit in any institution that has a branch in Oregon. If we want to go above that federal insurance limit, then we can only bank with institutions. I keep looking at the mayor, and I shouldn't do that, but we can only bank with institutions that the state treasurer has approved for us to bank with. And again, it's those institutions who say that they want to participate in the collateralization program.
And that's really, I mean, that's our fiduciary responsibility. We can't risk public dollars. So.
And it's actually personal liability on the treasurer's standpoint.
Well, congratulations.
If we don't do that. So I've been very keen over my 6 years as treasurer to make sure that we are following the ORS, because if we don't, I don't want to be personally responsible for that.
And what is FDIC limit now? $250,000?
$250,000.
Which
right.
Isn't much. For our purposes.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
Very good. Commissioner Saltzman.
So I'm really torn on this. I've banked personally at Wells Fargo or its predecessors, First National, First Interstate. The tellers are always remarking, well, you've had an account here for 30 plus years. And I've always liked, I think, and I think you helped distinguish this for me by talking about the commercial side of the bank and the private side of the bank. Well, I've always liked the private side of the bank. I see a rainbow of employees when I walk in there. I see them very present in our community at Pride Parade, things like that. Wells Fargo is outstanding. But I would ask you the same question. If they had perpetrated most of the abuses that they are being called to account for are things that happen to individuals. So I'm assuming that's the private side of the banking.
Yes.
Now, if they had done the same thing to us pressured us into opening accounts we probably didn't need, purchasing insurance we didn't need. I can't remember what the others were, but things like that. Would you be singing the same tune?
I'd be the first person to come to you and say, we're not getting the service that we are paying for, and that as a fiduciary, I have a responsibility to look out for the interests of the city and therefore go out to re-procure those services. I'm not seeing that. If I had been seeing that, I would be the first to tell you.
And I guess my dilemma is, can we afford to put blinders on? I mean, do we not have to also recognize the fact that the private side of the banking where these abuses took place probably took place because these were small people compared to the city of Portland account. You know, these are businesses, people like myself, you know, small fry, who it's easier to have these things perpetrated on and get away with it. And that's what I'm wrestling with. And isn't our job now as, you know, on the bigger side of the ledger to stick up for the little people who have been abused? And, you know, like I said, I have mixed feelings, but I do think we are at a point where, you know, punishment may be in order. And this is this is a small contract, $600,000 over 6 years, but still, where do we come down on this?
Several thoughts going through my mind with that. It's a small contract because one is that the bank offered to reduce its pricing for us in this contract than what we've been paying for. We are very judicious in the way we use our balances to earn credits, which is what we use to pay for a lot of our actual services. So the hard dollars that we spend don't happen that often for us to pay for our banking services. That's a way of providing services on the corporate and commercial side of the house that's not eligible for the individual side of the house. So it may look like a small contract in dollars, but it's actually fairly well ingrained in the city's operations. If we were to move our banking relationship, we would incur a six-figure cost to do that, and that would be hard dollar cost, time cost, and it would be a big risk for the city. Now, that's not to say that we wouldn't do it for the right reason, but if we are going to do it, I want it to be for the right reason.
So we have a corporate responsibility criteria in there.
Yes.
For 20 percentage points.
Yes.
And both U.S. Bank and J.P. Morgan Chase did better than Wells Fargo on the corporate responsibility. So why shouldn't we reward one of those institutions that did a better job, even though it's only 20% of the criteria? I think we're, you know, again, if you're in my mind, it's like, okay, we need to speak up for the other side of the operation, people who have been abused on the other side of the operation, the little people. We have an obligation. We can't just draw the line at, sorry, the corporate side's treated us great. You know, like I said, I have very positive personal feelings towards Wells Fargo, but I'm also feeling the offenses committed towards so many people is so outrageous that we ought to take a stand. And given the fact that they did not do as well on corporate responsibility as the other two contending institutions did, why wouldn't we go with one of them?
With the scores in front of me, it looks like they did do fairly well on the corporate responsibility side. So they were evaluated by the committee. They were not evaluated on paper as high as their competitors were. They did a much better job when they came in on their oral presentation regarding corporate responsibility than their competitors did. So perhaps it was the way they wrote the proposal as opposed to the way they came in person. The first responsibility I have wearing my city treasurer hat is to ensure that we are contracting with a vendor who can perform the services that we need for the city. I recognize that they have not done as well on the individual side, and I think we are highlighting that, and many of the cities who are wrestling with this very same question are highlighting that. The media is highlighting that. So they're not getting away scot-free, and they've been through an evaluation process and come out the other end as the top vendor.
If I could just add one
I
thing.
mean, I've looked at the criteria, and it looks like, I mean, all the point spreads are relatively close. It's all, you know, how big is big in terms of a difference.
Yeah.
But I saw 101 points in corporate responsibility for the other two and 93 for Wells Fargo. Now, again, that's not that big of a gap, but considering the whole point spread was probably less than, 30 points between three institutions.
Relative to the corporate responsibility, on the first round in the written proposals, that was a question that came forward from the evaluation team, was Wells Fargo's proposal seemed a tad bit vague on their corporate responsibility aspect. So utilizing that in the second round, the committee specifically built a question tied directly to their answer, which gave them an opportunity to really expand on what they had brought to the table on the front end. So yeah, maybe not quite as clean on the front, but when you got specific, when the committee got specific and said, okay, tell me about this, they did very well. So in the second round, they did score higher than all others on the corporate responsibility section, but there again, because it was a specific question, tell me about, and they did well.
So just legally, what are our options here? Do we either accept this or reject it, or can we pick one of the other finishers?
In the current climate, as my understanding of the legislative capacity, if you accept the report, you direct the chief procurement officer to initiate or execute the contract. If you reject the report, you would end up saying, go do it again. So,
but we can't amend the report, basically.
No, there's not a legislative capacity to amend the report that I'm aware of.
Okay.
That sounds
much
better.
Legal counsel's
Yes,
nodding.
yeah, they're sitting right there, so.
That would be unprecedented.
Very good. I'm sorry, Dan, are you done?
Yeah, I'm done.
Very good. Commissioner Fish.
When I moved here over 20 years ago and had a chance to learn more about Portland from some people that had lived here and had deeper roots, one of the things I learned is that it was not that long ago that we had banks that were headquartered in Portland that had presidents and CEOs headquartered in Portland. And over time, that changed. We became less a headquarter city, and we became more a branch office city. And this is, I guess, a philosophical question for you, Jennifer, but it may be relevant to my thinking. Is there a difference between whether Wells Fargo was headquartered here, was a national bank, and the practices were emanating from them as the nationally headquartered bank in our backyard, versus the situation that we're presented with, which is essentially a branch office of a national company that we've had a longstanding relationship with?
So it's very easy when your banker is 2 blocks away to visit and talk about issues or problems or ask questions. There aren't many services that we, at least in Treasury, are using today where the vendor is 2 blocks away. Until 2 years ago, our Wells Fargo relationship manager was in Portland, and then he retired, and we were moved to a relationship manager individual out of Seattle. He is down here frequently. He always answers the phone. It's really immaterial to me that he is physically here versus being in Seattle. Does that answer your question?
Sort of, but let me shift to another question.
Okay.
Because what I hear Commissioner Saltzman, part of the concern that I hear him expressing is that it's bad enough what we've learned about what the company has in essence admitted to. But this is a 6-year contract?
5.
5-year. But we're now potentially entering into a 5-year agreement, and we don't know whether there's been a fundamental change in culture. There could be other episodes that cause us to reconsider. So 2 questions on that front. One is, do we have an ironclad exit clause in the agreement should there be some event that comes to our attention that causes us to reconsider our relationship?
Yes, I'll take that part. Yes, the city has a cancellation for convenience clause.
For convenience.
For convenience.
So that means almost at our discretion.
Yes.
Well, it means exactly at our discretion. We would be able to, for any reason, at any time, terminate on a 30-day notice the contract.
And just as in terms of sort of our thinking about this, Ms. Cooperman, can you assure us that were there to be, in the future, were there to be new information or new circumstances that cause you to have any concerns about the relationship that we have with Wells Fargo, you would bring that to our attention immediately so the council could decide whether to exercise that clause?
Absolutely.
And I guess the final question, for me, and it's just in fairness, someone gave me a copy of an online editorial that the Oregonian ran, and one of the paragraphs begins with a statement, but Wells Fargo's, quote, misleading answer on its application to a question on corporate responsibility, blah, blah, blah. I didn't check the hyperlinks, and I didn't see anything in the editorial that referred to that, but since that certainly goes to the question of the integrity of the application, do you know what the Oregonian editorial board is referring to in terms of an alleged misleading answer on Wells Fargo's application?
Yes. In our section of the RFP regarding qualifications, we asked a question. We asked the proposer to disclose whether in the last 5 years that the entity or any key personnel had been the subject of any regulatory action or significant civil or criminal actions related to the services described in this RFP. And the bank's response was to give us a link to their annual report or their SEC filing, where they have a section regarding actions against the institution. So one needed to click the link, go read their response, rather than see the response written out for them. It was because of that question that we then followed up in the oral presentation with the following question. Elaborate on your response to question 8. Explain your process to discover and remediate the bank's fraudulent sales practices, such as fake accounts, et cetera. Elaborate on efforts, accomplishments to remediate the bank's culture and compensation systems.
Are you satisfied, based on your follow-up question, did you make a judgment at any time during the process that their initial answer was misleading?
It wasn't misleading in that they denied having those issues. It was just hard to find.
And so you took the opportunity in the interview to press them on that?
Yes.
And you were then satisfied with their response?
Yes. The bank brought a team of individuals, each of whom spoke to that issue.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. First of all, Jennifer, here we are again. I want to go through these in no particular order. Number one, Commissioner Fish asked a philosophical question about the loss of the headquarters of banks and us becoming, as he described it, something of a branch city. I would like to say we lost a tremendous amount during that process, and I would argue that this is a national trend. It is not just something happening in Portland, Oregon. I'm mindful of the fact that we have George Passador sitting here today, who has served in the capacity as chairman and president of Wells Fargo, Oregon, and Southwest Washington. There are many people who work in the Wells Fargo regional network, including Tracy Curtis, who is responsible for it, and I know her personally, and I know the commitment that the regional bank has to social movements, nonprofit efforts, philanthropic support here in this community. And frankly, I find the local organization out of step with the national organization. And I find that a good thing. I think the national organization of Wells Fargo could learn a thing or two from the regional organization. I'd like to know something about, oh, and by the way, just with regard to credit unions, yes, I did champion the bill along with current treasurer Tobias Reed, who is then state representative Tobias Reed, around credit unions participating in public fund depository actions. And the hope was to bring them into parity when it comes to public funds depository operations. The problem, of course, is they're just way, way, way too small. You have to be a really large, sophisticated banking operation to be able to do the business at the scale that we do business. And you'll notice there's a lot of big-name banks that weren't even on the list because they just don't have the capacity to do it. You mentioned that our primary client relationship is with somebody in Seattle. And I assume that it sounds like you feel that that individual and the operation here at the regional level is responsive. And I got that feeling, but I want to explore that a little bit more.
Our account representative is very responsive to all of our inquiries. The bank has a team that is available to us, so I might call on a macro issue and someone on the Treasury team might call about a particular check and was that check cashed. So the bank has a variety of resources that are available to us. Some are in California, some are in the state of Washington, and they are all available to us every time that we call.
So there's the next two on the list, in no particular order, J.P. Morgan Chase, that's Jamie Dimon's operation, and the U.S. Bank. I was a huge fan of Malia Wasson, and that one of our primary banking relationships for the state of Oregon. We had $90 billion of assets and about I believe it was about $175 billion in transactions annually. We did business with, I believe it was about 28 different banking institutions here in the state of Oregon. Malia Wasson, when she ran the U.S. bank operations here, was fabulous, and her team was fabulous, and they were highly responsive to our needs. And this gets back to Commissioner Fish's philosophical question. U.S. Bank shifted some of its operations and nationalized them, if I can use that term. Malia Wasson retired, and the quality of the relationship deteriorated precipitously and rapidly. And effectively, for certain lines of business, my recollection is they were terminated. J.P. Morgan, again, a big bank, lots of capacity. In my capacity as state treasurer, my recollection is I sued them at least once. So when we look at these big banking institutions, we are somewhat beholden to the reality that there are few banks that are of large scale and sufficient capacity to be able to do the business that we do and do it competently, but that's obviously coming with some trade-offs that are endemic to the modern banking industry. And we all saw this exposed in 2008. There were many books written on this subject, Too Big to Fail, amongst others. And we need to find the way to encourage local capacity around banking operations. But in the meanwhile, our choices are precipitously limited if our primary focus is ethics. And that is too bad. It really is to me. And as somebody who started my banking career at a California-based bank called Bank of America, and I watched it grow and nationalize and its headquarter operations move around, and I believe I sued them as well as state treasurer. In fact, I think it was one of my first acts as state treasurer.
Awfully litigious, Ted.
It feels that way. Yeah, it feels that way, and yeah, that's what we're dealing with. Now, Dan made a really good case here around ethics. Made a really good case, and I know Dan to be an ethical and principled man, so when he talks about ethics, I listen. Seattle went down this road, didn't they? Yes. What happened in Seattle?
Seattle, the city of Seattle has banked with Wells Fargo for a number of years, and they had similar discussions at their city council about the appropriateness of continuing to bank with Wells Fargo. They stated publicly that they were going to rebid for their banking services and wanted to change from Wells Fargo to another institution. They received no bids. There were no banks that stepped up to say that they wanted to provide the services for the city of Seattle.
So they came back to Wells Fargo.
So the city, realizing that they were left without a provider, picked up the phone and called Wells Fargo and said, would you mind remaining our bank? And the bank said yes, and so my understanding is that they are currently negotiating a new contract.
Not a great position to negotiate
Not a great
from.
position to be negotiating from. Not particularly great politics either, I might add. Commissioner Fish?
I don't want to rain on what's been an outstanding discussion. I have an absence coming up, and I have to introduce someone at PSU, so.
Could I just ask one more
Yeah.
question, then I'm done? How many banking relationships do we currently have at the City of Portland?
About 15.
About 15. And so this isn't the only bank that we do business with.
This is the only bank that provides us the depository and other related services. We do a significant amount of work with U.S. Bank. They're our custodian. They do our lockbox. They do our merchant activity. And the rest of the relationships are on the depository side.
Yeah, and they're very good at those services, I should say. I rained on them a little bit, but in those areas, they've been very good, and I want to acknowledge that publicly. Very good. So that ends my line of questioning. Colleagues, anything else?
I move the report.
We have a motion. I'll second it. Sue, could you please call the roll?
Well, first of all, I want to say I greatly appreciate this conversation, and this conversation really predates this hearing when Jennifer Cooperman offered briefings to each council office about the process and the looming decision, and really appreciate the time, Jennifer, you've taken to educate us about this. I want to begin by disclosing something. It's not a conflict. I'm not required to disclose it, but I think transparency is the best way to go. I currently bank at On Point Credit Union and have a couple of things, including, I think, an auto loan through them. And I have an account with Wells Fargo. I think I'm probably in their lost leader account file because I don't have a mortgage, I don't have any loans, but they do provide very low-cost checking services for my wife and me. Again, I'm not required to disclose that. I don't have a stake, personal financial stake in this, but I think it's important. I believe this is a very close call. And I think historically we have been very reluctant to overturn a procurement report unless there was an extraordinary circumstance. First of all, I have reviewed this to see, did we follow our process? I think you've made it very clear in your written submission and in your oral presentation, the process has been clean. And the fact that there were no protests filed is reassuring to us, because the protests are often how we learn that there's some concern about the process. Nowhere have I learned that Wells Fargo was ineligible to apply. And I'm guessing, although this is just surmise, that they were subjected to a heightened scrutiny given the times we live in. I thought something that Ms. Cooperman said in passing was interesting about, and important, about the six-figure cost of switching to another bank. That should not be a deterrent for us deciding what we think is best for our city, but I think it is something to be factored in. I'm encouraged that we have an ironclad exit clause that allows us to terminate the relationship at any time at our discretion. Now, as a candidate, I learned that there's great enthusiasm in our community for things like a city bank. There's great enthusiasm at the statewide level for a state bank. And who knows what the banking landscape will look like tomorrow, much less next year and the year after. But I think it's important that the contract that you are asking us to enter into has an exit clause which is basically at our discretion. I have confidence that we can enter into this relationship with our eyes wide open. I have great confidence that Jennifer Cooperman and her team will bring to our attention any conduct which she thinks calls into question the viability of our relationship with Wells Fargo. And she would do that promptly, and the council would have the right to make its decision. I very much appreciated what the mayor said about Wells Fargo locally. I don't know whether they got points. Perhaps it fits under corporate responsibility. I have been struck over the years by the number of good causes they support and underwrite, and I particularly appreciate for their stalwart support of the LGBTQ community. I was also reflecting on the prospect of not awarding this contract to Wells Fargo, but going to JP Morgan Chase, which, as just a casual reader of the paper, they seem to be in the front lines of trying to gut in every possible way Dodd-Frank and many of the reforms that were put in place to prevent the kind of meltdown that occurred once in my lifetime, and we hope doesn't happen again. The Seattle experience is instructive. Be careful what you ask for. Seattle looked at this, said it was a close call, looked beyond the procurement process to the symbolism, went out and looked for other banks, found the door closed, and came back to Wells Fargo. I would prefer not to put you through that exercise, even though in this case, our only option if we voted to decline the report would be to reopen the process and wait to see. So we can't predict what would happen. But it seems to me, on a very close call, you've made a case for us to continue what has been a productive relationship with what, at least locally, has been a pretty good corporate citizen. And therefore, I vote aye.
Salzman.
Well, as I said, I have very mixed feelings here, but I do think I'm going to come down on the side of the conduct on the corporate side of the operation and the conduct on the private banking side of the operation, the small people, the retail customers, like you and I, who have been taken advantage of by this institution through fraudulent practices of pressuring people to open more accounts than they need, opening accounts in people's names without even telling them, forcing them to buy insurance that was probably unnecessary. And this wasn't just applied probably to every account holder. It was probably applied to those who were poor and probably largely minority account holders. And that is, to me, something us banking on the corporate side ought to take note of and ought to take an action. It's a symbolic action, as I said. It's small potatoes to a Wells Fargo, to a JP Morgan Chase, very small potatoes. And we may end up in the Seattle situation, but that's never stopped us from taking what we believe are important actions in the past. We have taken plenty of actions here in this city council without regard to cost. And 6 digits is probably one of the smaller costs we've incurred for some of the symbolic actions this council has taken. So I don't buy that. And I do believe, we need to send a message. And as I said earlier, punishment is in order. If we don't punish Wells Fargo now, I can't imagine what circumstances might bring us back to the table to exercise that clause that says the convenience clause. If we don't do it based on what's in front of us right now, we will never do it. So I believe that we should find another bank and, 5 years, put Wells Fargo on a 5 years corrective action plan. If they can come back in 5 years and really show, A, they've remedied every customer that's been harmed by their fraudulent practices, B, that they've learned some lessons, and C, that, we mean more to them than maybe other banking customers. 5 years from now, maybe the city council will have a change of heart. But I believe right now that punishment is in order, and I vote no.
Udaley.
Well, I appreciate the deliberation on this subject and your presentation. I especially appreciate the principled stand my colleague just took. I largely agree with him. However, I don't believe that there is a viable alternative that is any more attractive than Wells Fargo. I'm concerned that if we reopen the process, we will be in a weakened bargaining or negotiating position, and I'm concerned about the cost of the city. I do want to say I would love to see us pursue other alternatives that we haven't talked about today, specifically municipal banking. But with regrets and reservations, I vote aye.
Wheeler.
So this has been as interesting a conversation as I predicted it would be. First of all, I want to thank the Chief Financial Officer Cooperman and Larry. I want to thank you for withstanding hours of testimony with us this week. I've spent more time with you than my family, probably by a factor of 3. This is not an easy one, obviously. And as well, first of all, I also want to acknowledge the selection committee. We had a lot of people from great, well-respected community institutions who agreed to do this process with us and put their institutional names on the record, and they did not have to do that. And as I look at sort of the top 3 banks on the list here, if this had failed today, and I'm going to obviously vote to support the procurement report, I'm going to put my trust and my faith in you, and I have a lot of trust and faith in you, and the diligence of the selection committee, and everything I've heard leads me to believe they did a very thorough job. But I think about, Commissioner Fish cracked a joke, am I a lawyer? Actually, the Attorney General and I were very, very busy with all of these institutions. Not all of the institutions on the list, but the vast majority, and I'm thinking of foreign exchange fraud. One of the banks that we have just mentioned, does the London Whale ring a bell? There was a lawsuit there as well. None of these institutions are squeaky clean, and they should all be. They should all be. And so the comments that Commissioner Saltzman made about taking a principled stand, I agree with all of the reasons that he stated. I just don't think it practically gets us anywhere, because you will simply bring back one of those other institutions, and I will have to sit here and say, in all full disclosure, I fired that institution. How could I hire them here? If they weren't good enough at the state treasury, they're certainly not good enough for me now at the city of Portland. Or if I had to sue them 1 or 2 or 3 different times for malfeasance, why would I vote for them now? And I'm putting a bet on Tracy Curtis. I'm putting a bet on George Passador, because there are people from our community who support our community or are engaged in philanthropy in our community, and I know where to find them. And I know where Wells Fargo is, because I look out my window at them. And so I feel more confident in this engagement than some of the potential other options that are on the table here. Now, for the longer term, I think there's an interesting question for our Chief Financial Officer, which is this contract of necessity is large and it is complex. And it is large and it is complex because of the way we organize our systems and our desire for centralization and economies of scale to keep costs low in our banking operations. This is Portland, Oregon, and people in Portland, Oregon, like Dan said, or at least intimated, care a lot about ethics, and they care a lot about morality. And many people like me are very disturbed about the direction that our banking and our financed institutions have taken in recent years, and their seeming reluctance to make genuine steps towards the kind of reform that the public needs to see to have confidence in our not only national but our global financial system. Maybe we need to actually do something different in terms of breaking our system down a little bit and maybe sacrifice some of that centralization or sacrifice some of those economies of scale in exchange for being able to get the next rung of regional banks into the mix to bid on it. There is a cost. I want to be very clear. I don't want to pretend there is not. But maybe that incremental additional cost is actually worth it in terms of supporting institutions that are regional in nature. For example, Umpqua. And I'm not making a commercial or a pitch, but they're not on the list. They're not on the list because even they don't have the capacity, apparently, to bid for this size of business, the size and complexity. So maybe we need to be doing more to encourage the cultivation and development of some of our more local banks, because I think the closer you get to Portland, Oregon, the closer you're going to get to our values. That's my personal belief. So I vote aye to accept the report. The procurement report is accepted. We are adjourned. Thank you.